Here we'll go over an overview of what decomposition is and how it relates to ecosystem carbon balance. Decomposition ultimately converts detritus, that is dead organic matter, to CO2 and mineral nutrients in a remnant pool of complex organic compounds that resist further microbial breakdown. So really quickly, we have our pool of organic matter, and there's a couple fates. It can go to CO2, and we'll talk about that. And some of that organic matter are actually not just carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, carbohydrates, but there's mineral nutrients in there, and those are also released as inorganic nutrients. And in addition, there's some residual from this initial pool that remains in the soil. And that's a pool of the complex organic compounds that are very resistant to microbial breakdown. We call that recalcitrant organic matter. Decomposition is a consequence of interacting physical and chemical processes occurring inside and outside of living soil microbes and animals. So when we talk about decomposition, there are physical and chemical processes that are occurring, and some of these are happening within the soil, and that would be outside of the microbes, and some of them are actually happening inside of animals. But essentially anything that's happening to dead organic matter that's being driven by inorganic or organic processes, whether that's microbes or animals, we consider decomposition. So decomposition is a broad class or category of different processes that end up affecting organic matter. One of these processes is considered leaching. And what leaching is the transfer of soluble material away from decomposing organic matter and into the environment. So just like how you can have leaves on the soil surface, when water hits those leaves, some of the material that's contained in the leaves is soluble. That's going to enter the water and then enter the soil as the water passes through those leaves into the soil. This is a transfer of soluble material. It doesn't necessarily change the chemical composition, but it's a movement and a breaking apart of soluble and non-soluble materials. Leaching is one of the first components of decomposition. The second is fragmentation. Fragmentation breaks large pieces of organic matter into smaller ones. Some of this is due to physical factors, others biotic factors that are important for breaking up large pieces into smaller pieces. And this is important because fragmentation increases the surface area. So the surface area of a large chunk compared to many small chunks, there's a lot more surface area here, and that means there's more area for enzymes and microbes to attack that organic matter and work on it. If there was no fragmentation, decomposition would be greatly retarded. Lastly, there's chemical alteration. So the first step was leaching, and that's soluble material from insoluble material. The next step is to take this insoluble material and take it from big chunks into smaller chunks. Now lastly, there's chemical alteration that happens, and that's changing the actual chemistry of the compounds that are remaining after leaching and fragmentation. Chemical alteration primarily is a consequence of the activity of soil microbes. And the way that soil microbes chemically alter organic matter is through the production of exoenzymes. So these are enzymes that are released outside of the microbes. So they're in the environment, and soil organic matter that's present comes into contact with exoenzymes that break it apart and transform it. Now, the consequence of all these processes is that you start with something that's recognizable, like a leaf. And then leaching occurs, fragmentation occurs, and then eventually there's soil organic matter that's relatively unrecognizable as to whether initially it was a leaf or a root or a piece of stem. When it's no longer recognizable, that's when we generally consider it to be soil organic matter. So once we have soil organic matter, what happens to it? Well, generally soil organic matter can be processed further, and one of the things that happens to it is mineralization. The process of mineralization is taking an organic substance and turning it into an inorganic state. So a carbohydrate, for example, turned into water and CO2 is a process of mineralization, because we start with organic carbon and then we end up with inorganic carbon. So the carbon is said to be mineralized. In addition, that soil organic matter that's present in the soil can complex with clay minerals, for example, or undergo nonenzymatic chemical reactions to form more complex compounds. So we talked about clay minerals that would have a surface charge, for example, and they might be negatively charged, which gives us cation exchange capacity, and soil organic matter might have a positive charge to it. And it becomes complex, so there's an attraction between the clays and the soil organic matter. And this causes the soil organic matter to be more resistant to further breakdown. In addition, there's a number of other chemical reactions that can happen that don't happen necessarily via enzymes, but that causes the soil organic matter to form even more complex compounds. So you start with something simple and you end up with something more complex. Long-term persistence of organic matter in soils depends on chemical recalcitrance and sorption of organic compounds to clay surfaces. If we didn't have clay surfaces in soils, for example, if all soils were just sand, and there was no further chemical processing of organic matter to make it more biochemically recalcitrant, such that it was hard to break down via enzymes, we would have very little organic matter left in soil.